Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you had some time to walk around, breathe the night air or the morning air or whatever variety of air you are experiencing right now. Um, it is my absolute great honor to introduce one of my favorite pigment people in all the world, and that is Thomas Little, um, who Thomas is an ink maker and an ink historian. And, if I had to be stuck in an elevator with somebody, it would be my first choice would be Thomas for a few reasons. The first is that he has more fascinating things to say than any human I've ever been around. Based on his own personal alchemical ink making experiments and his deep relationship with all kinds of materials, everything from dissolved guns to slime mold and many other substances. The second reason that I'd want to be in the elevator with Thomas is that he's a poet, mystic, comedian. And so his words are just pure music and also sort of revelatory, deep guffaws. And lastly, he is also one of the kindest people that I have ever met. And I think that you will feel his huge heartedness coming out in this presentation. So it's my great delight to present Thomas to you with something that he has been concocting that I think is going to be pure magic. And without any further ado, I will pass you over. Introduces you to the chthonic organ of perception and many other things.
Hello, fellow mark makers, artists, scientists, and dirt lovers. Um, Thank you for attending my talk. Uh, my name's Thomas Little. I'm an ink maker and pigment maker and artist. I'm very interested in the patterns in nature and the means of communicating between life forms and organisms, including human communication, um, language, etymology, and things like that. So a little bit about my interests. Today, though, I would like to talk a little bit about my practice, or really more of a way of thinking that informs my practice. I'm employing this toy theater as a visual aid. It helped me organize my thoughts, as well as I hope maybe provide a little bit of a sense of wonder for you guys. So I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the learning process and the problem we face as students in our various fields. I consider myself a student. I'm mostly self-taught. Uh, I also like to think of operating in a variety of disciplines. So the problem that I encounter, the issue that I feel like is very much a recurring thing, is the tradition of our learning, like a lot of traditions in the Western world, is very steeped in the Enlightenment way of thinking. The Enlightenment, as some of you may know, was a big intellectual movement. Um, Rene Descartes was probably one of the big stars. The Cartesian way of thinking, I think, therefore I am. Uh, the mind-body duality was another concept that he sort of put forth. The Enlightenment tradition has a lot of things that are inhibitive in a creative way of seeing the universe. There's a lot of false certainties, hierarchical structures, sort of organized along the idea of the great chain of being, where we have rocks, and then we have funguses, plants, animals, humans, onwards and upwards towards divinity. There's also a lot of hard lines and categorization along the idea of like a reductionist system. Like we have mathematics, going to physics, going to chemistry, going to biology, going to psychology, and so forth. And there's still this sort of this sense of a linearity to it, moving from like something base to something more complicated, along those lines. These concepts I have a hard time with. They're very isolating and stratifying. The tradition that I like to think in is one that is sort of more along the lines of an alchemical tradition. Alchemy, of course, means a lot of things to a lot of different people. That's sort of one of the beauties of it. There is definitely a chemical aspect to it, a scientific aspect to it. There's also a philosophic aspect to it and an artistic aspect to it. Lots of mystical symbols exist in alchemy. And that's one of the beauties of alchemy too, is that it has an allowance for mystery in the understanding of mystery. And as such, it blends the lines between us, the different disciplines that we consider now as being separate. That's what I sort of think of as the beauty of alchemy. My personal definition of alchemy is sort of like a place, a table, where the arts and science and magic can exist. Um, it also is like it's a place where we can find truth in liminal places, whereas the Enlightenment sort of puts us more into like trying to find truth in the hard lines of facts. The truth that I want to seek is something that exists in a hazy place, a place that's sort of between concrete things. I feel like this truth is a mysterious truth and a richer truth. The other thing about alchemy is that it's more considerate of pluralities. Things exist more than just in one plane. There's like a sense of similarities between things like as above and so below. Like they echo through different spheres within the world. Uh, there's the self similarity, sort of fractality to it in a way, um, which is another thing that sort of helps in like understanding and blending the lines between what we think of as different disciplines. Um, so yeah, the Enlightenment is has a lot going against it. There's a lot of things that can be laid at its feet, and it probably deserves the what is laid at its feet. We have the othering of things, the othering of our fellow humans. We have the othering of the animals and the plants and the earth and the resources. Or we see them as resources. We don't see them as things anymore. Um, I mean, we could say like, I mean, the roots of colonialism and capitalism all sort of could like be tied back to this line of thinking. Um, and one of the big concepts that I'm going to talk about a little bit later is the mind-body duality that Rene Descartes, the Cartesian legacy, has sort of left us with. And that is sort of the seed from which we begin the othering of um, others, where we start to realize we're a self, we're an individual within and above our heads, in our skulls, where there's a little self thing that exists as an avatar. Um, and this is sort of like spurs off this sort of fractal othering of our fellow humans and the world around us. Whereas I feel like the alchemical tradition is a little more harmonious. It's more along the ideas of like the dissolution and reformation and transformation um, within the alembic, within like the vessel, the flask. Uh, it's holistic, it's cyclical. And what I have here is a very um, common symbol that you see in a lot of alchemical texts is the Ouroboros. I have it as a color wheel Um, you'll notice that the purple is the head and the tail. And I think I did that because purple is to me a liminal color. It's one of those places where you sort of can set off on your journey of understanding the mysteries of the universe. Purple, of course, is interesting because it's blending the red end of the spectrum into the blue end of the spectrum, which we know as being very different wavelengths. Yet our mind can do that, sort of pinches off this little bubble of perception. And the little scar, the little omphalos, the navel is there in the blending of purple. Um, so that's one of the reasons why I did that. The Ouroboros is also, of course, cyclical. It's recycling itself. It's devouring itself. It's um, endlessly connected. It's not linear like the Enlightenment thinking is. And the linearity of Enlightenment thinking automatically encompasses a sort of fatalistic attitude as we're moving up this ladder that seems almost kind of endless or like fatalistic, or not endless, but if we were ever to reach the end, it would be a the end. Um, so that's sort of the problem with that. Maybe at this point you're perhaps wondering, what does this have to do with pigments? Well, I mean, pigments are stuff we make marks with, mark making stuff. And often those marks are symbolic. They're representative of things that are not present or that are unseen. Um, the Enlightenment attitude would maybe see a line drawn between this stuff, where we have the material being irrelevant because it's expressing this higher ideal, the of the mental world. Whereas an alchemical attitude would incorporate sort of the as above, so below sort of maxim of things connecting in a way in different spheres in a similar manner. Um, Symbols are, the avatars of mystery. They're sort of like the vehicles of transcendence. And if we have, trying to access transcendence using the model of enlightenment thinking, we're climbing a, endless ladder, this unattainable transcendence that'll always be, you know, a little bit further ahead. And I feel like this sort of denial of of transcendence, this denial of mystery, creates its reiterations of a frustrated creativity that doesn't really pay any attention to it pays no heed to its consumption. It sort of is just this hunger because it's never fulfilled. Whereas we think more along an alchemical um, way of thinking, we constantly are in interaction with the transcendent. It's part of the practice. It's sort of just something that's there in the cycles that we're moving through. And like if we have this like hunger that we're left with, this unsatisfied hunger from an enlightenment attitude, it sort of just keeps building and building, and it's like a very feverish paradigm that's sort of just devouring the world. um, and I feel like there's a way to move through that, a way to end it. And I feel like part of it is in connecting the symbol to the material world, the medium to the message. Just as we, as pigment makers and users and studiers and students of pigments, understand the connection between the pigment and the color with a place on the earth. Um, we should also be making those connections between the symbolic and the supernatural realms of the mind to patterns that we see in the universe and elements of the universe that echo those things. And in this way, we sort of can, like, combine the sacred and the profane and the marriage of heaven and hell, like William Blake described, um, and tie the beauty back to the earthy. Um, To go back a little bit more on the Enlightenment attitude, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the mind-body duality. And one of the biggest reasons that this is still so prevalent in our world is, I think, and maybe it's, I think it's true, is that there's the driving fear of death. The fear of death is a driving factor. The fear of death sort of keeps this mind and body duality in place. We can find some comfort in thinking that our mind is separate from our body. Our soul is immortal and incorruptible while our body decays. Sort of encourage an unhealthy relationship between what we consider, what is really one whole organism. And of course, that radiates out, as I said earlier, in the othering process. Um, Along these lines of the mind and body distinction, we also find the lines, where the symbolic and the physical are, and the supernatural and the natural. Um, this whole fear-driven distinction, uh, it undermines the foundation of Western thought. And the universe understood in terms of fear. It blinds us to the true nature of the universe and ourselves and the relationship between ourselves and the universe. So now that we can sort of reimagine without the obstacle, the mind-body duality in place, we can sort of start to tie the mystic and the ethereal to the earthy world and have that mystery sort of equally allotted. But for now, since we're still sort of in the bony theater of our skull, um, let's talk a little bit about the supernatural world, specifically visions. There's lots of visions historically recorded that sort of create the architecture and the entities of our, what we perceive of as the supernatural world. There's a few cases where we can document the conditions that these were caused under. A few of them are like altered states, of course, some sort of mind-altering substance, some sort of psychoactive substance. Uh, Shamanism, religious ecstasies, things of that sort of spiritual nature as well. There are ways to induce these visions through trance states. Trance states also could include scrying, looking through a crystal ball and seeing these visions. Very well-known cases are also in near-death experiences. Visions also occur due to medical conditions and in between periods of sleep and wakefulness. Now, a lot of these visions have qualities that are similar. Bright colors, symmetrical qualities, movement, and dynamism of shape. Things are always shifting, and almost like a kaleidoscope. These things are all very psychedelic, of course, because essentially that's what they are. They are psychedelic experiences. And I would like to share some of my psychedelic experiences with you. I've experienced visions in under certain conditions that were both induced by me and also induced by just some stress that my body was going through. The first one I would like to talk about is was a hypnopompic vision, and that is to say, it occurred as I was waking. I was experimenting with a interrupted sleep pattern, and I was also taking mugwort tincture. Mugwort's an herb that's sort of known to stimulate your dream life. I was trying to encourage visions through sleep deprivation experiments. And it worked. This occurred. I was fully conscious. I watched it fade. So that would differentiate from a dream. And this is sort of what it looked like. It was a red star that was in the middle of a red sky, and surrounding it was dark foliage in this circular frame, sort of. Yeah. And my second vision that I had was known as a hypnagogic vision. Hypnagogic, I think I'm saying that right, is one that occurs as you're falling asleep. Um, in this instance, I was napping with a rather unpleasant toothache going on, and those are sort of those were sort of the conditions in this. It was a bit of stress induced by pain. Um, I, of course, arose and recorded it before I fell further into sleep. And this is sort of what it looked like. This was a black and red and yellow. I perceived it as a snake that was coiling sort of endlessly into a sunburst. Of course, I perceived it as a snake. There was no head or tail, but I did sense scales, and also the coiling motion sort of made me think more of it as a snake. And now I sort of think of it a little bit as my own personal Ouroboros in a way. These visions are not unique; they're common throughout history. Uh, they may have even happened to you, and perhaps, uh, like me, you assign descriptors to them, like snake or star or sun or foliage. Um, Maybe you even assign more profound meaning if the conditions were traumatic or ecstatic. Uh, like the common experiences with near death experiences, of course, we see the tunnel of light in the end of a dark tunnel and sort of a sense of ascension. A lot of people interpret this as the spirit um, moving towards paradise or heaven or whatever nether region you want to label it. Of course, if we can visualize this experience, it has very similar qualities to these guys. There's a sort of a central point, and a sense of movement. So that's sort of how these would relate to that. And there's also, we could speculate that the basis for some holy visions in that have made it into canonical texts um, are perhaps uh, related to this phenomenon. My personal favorite is um, the visions of Ezekiel, in which he describes uh, angels known as the Ophanim. I believe I'm saying that right. I don't know, which were wheels within wheels that all had eyes along the rims, which is really cool. um, but daydream, prosaic daydream, or profound spiritual revelation. These things can be understood scientifically as form constants. In 1926, Heinrich Kluber, a psychologist, was studying the visual perceptions of subjects on mescaline. And he was recording these brightly colored geometric patterns that reoccurred in different users. He even went so far as to categorize them in 4 different types. Those 4 types were the tunnel or funnel, the spiral, uh, cobwebs or spider webs, and the lattices or honeycombs or grates. He called them 2 different things, but sort of this pattern. Um, as you can see, there's a lot of interplay between these things. They sort of have similar characteristics. The tunnel and the spiral and the cobweb all have sort of like a central focal point. The tunnel and the cobweb also have a radial symmetry, and the cobweb and the honeycomb have a sort of cellular quality in these little boxes and shapes. The spiral is interesting in that it exhibits what's known as a chirality, and chirality is like the handedness. It's like it'll either spiral clockwise or counterclockwise. So that's an interesting little bit of asymmetry there. So the neurological mechanisms that are behind these form constants are part of the functional organization of the visual cortex. Um, Say we have no stimulus, we're in a dark room. Certain things will arise, entoptic phenomena, phosphenes, sort of glowing things that we perceive, as well as neurological noise, which happens more in the brain and the connection and the optic nerve. The noise can be enhanced with stress or drugs. And then we have sort of what happens is the visual cortex wants to seek a pattern in what all this noise. Sort of, I think of it sort of as analogous to the snake in my vision. It wasn't necessarily a snake, but it was something I wanted to be a snake. I saw scales, I saw coiling, and my brain made it into a snake. And the visual cortex is, like that too. Just like we seek meaning in our experiences in the universe, the visual cortex seeks patterns in the darkness. Uh, the brain recapitulates itself in a fractal manner, self-similar on a variety of scales. Uh, it's, and in this sense, it's revealing, the visual cortex is sort of revealing the organization of the neurons in our brains as a visual model. It's literally and symbolically seeing the wheels and gears of the brain turning, which is amazing and fascinating and terribly interesting. um, but of course, this hardly really leaves the realm of the bony theater of the mind. Indeed, it seems like it's almost the height of reductionist thinking to reduce the sacrosanct realm of visions to the complex but understandable mechanisms of neurobiology. But of course, context is crucial. Reductionism is a useful tool in understanding the universe, but it is not a means to an end. To appreciate these phenomena, we have to go to the world in which and from which we are formed. Ta-da! The natural world. See, it's not just the brain, but nature that recapitulates. And the brain recapitulates because the nature recapitulates. Recapitulation sort of runs through the universe. Um, Form constant processes utilize the same forces that shape patterns in nature. I mean, they are the same forces, the same ideas. In 1952, Alan Turing wrote a paper called The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis. And it was describing how patterns, spirals, stripes, can arise from a homogeneous state. Um, these are like mechanisms for formation of patterns in animal skin and animal structure. And the models he was using in this paper are known as reaction diffusion models. Reaction diffusion models are math models, and they're used for a lot of phenomena. Maybe the best illustrative way to understand them is through physics and chemistry. So, say we have two components, each with different qualities of reactivity and diffusibility. Um, say we have substance A, it activates a certain chemical reaction, but it diffuses slowly through space. And we have substance B, which perhaps inhibits the reaction, but diffuses much faster through space. These parameters, it's within these parameters that patterns can organize from homogeneous states. They create a sort of instability with its own inertia, what is described as a parametric spatiotemporal oscillation. But outside of the flask, we can alter these parameters. We can use them to model planetary phenomena. We can use them to model mineral formation. We can use them to model meteorological phenomena. In the ecological world, we can think about predator-prey relationships with these models. We can think about fungal colony growth. And as with Alan Turing, we can think about the morphogenesis of organisms, not just in the patterns of our external skins, but also our bodily organization. Which brings us back to form constants. Neuron behavior is a reaction diffusion system. So some neurons behave like substance A, which is slowly diffuses through the brain, but also activates certain patterns. And some neurons act like substance B, which would inhibit these reactions and would move faster through the brain. And altered states, of course, affect the balance. And when these altered states, be it from stress, be it from use of psychotropic substances, religious ecstasies, what have you, it affects the balance and an instability arises. This instability sort of creates these visions, which are glimpses of the brain's architecture, interpreted as the supernatural. And it is, in a way. This is sort of a truth that we find in a liminal place. I think of this as like form constants and this phenomena as the spirit maze of form and color. But spirit in more like the animistic sense. Form constants and patterns, they're not just like a labyrinth we move through like ghosts in our skull, but they're also the expression of the animus of the universe in the shapes and patterns that reverberate and connect through the symbolic and supernatural worlds. It connects the symbolic and supernatural to solid earthy processes. It's the spirit moving through physical matter. And there's an essential quality to these patterns. Forms a structural signal, which is the architecture of world, of organism, of mind. How do we perceive this signal? Well, Goethe said once, any object well considered opens within us a new organ of perception. I hope to open what I would call the chthonic organ of perception with the consideration of these concepts and models and patterns. The chthonic organ, I use the word chthonic, which comes from Greek, which is earth, the Greek word for earth, but in English has come to mean that of the underworld, which is to say Hades, or that realm. So within that word right there, we have the connection of the natural and the supernatural, which I think is lovely. I also like that word because it refers to the Greek deities that were overthrown by the Olympian deities. The older Greek deities were chimerical creatures. They were hybrids of animals and humans. They were monsters, sort of, where they became monsters uh, after being conquered by the Olympian gods. And I see very much a Cartesian difference here. Like we're taking like these Greek gods, which their forms we still use as ideals in judging how the human body is supposed to look, um, and we're like recentering it on this very human-centric group of gods. What do you call it? The group of gods, and we're like rejecting the more than human, the animal aspects, the earthy aspects, into the realm of like monsters. So that's another interesting part of that word that I like to think of. And also phonic law, which is the law, of a way of incorporating a law into the sacred character of the universe. All these qualities are really integral to my process of seeing the world and seeing these patterns as something that connects the magical realm, the transcendental realm, the spiritual realm, the realm of the mind with the very earthy realm of the universe and the concrete. Uh, and this is sort of what I want to awaken within other people. I want people to understand that this is uh, a way of perceiving the world. It's a way of opening up this organ within us to perceive the world in a more rich and mysterious way. It's an alchemical way of seeing the world. And I mean, as pigment people, I think we can appreciate this connection with mark making, symbol making, with the stuff of the physical world. I mean, we do that already. We're using material that we understand has a geography and a geology and a history. And like there's all these rich connections with this material that we're using to make our symbols and our representatives of the supernatural mental world. Uh, and I hope that by outlining these concepts from the alchemical perspective, I can enrich this connection and hopefully reawaken a sense of wonder that is ever present in our universe. Um, and I would like to thank you for taking your time to listen to me, and may have some questions and answers later. And I gladly will do my best to try to answer them. Thank you again. I appreciate your time and listening. Bye.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi. Hi. Thank you, Thomas. That was profound and moving and beautiful and subtle, and I can't wait to listen to it many more times.
Thank you.
As folks can maybe see, we're doing something really techno advanced here called holding the telephone up to the computer. So that's how we're going to approach this particular technical experience that we're having right now. So I'd like to invite questions, and I'm just looking for questions from the audience here for Thomas. And I'm not seeing any right now.
There is one thing that I noticed in the description that I failed to include in my presentation. There was going to be mention of slime mold, which didn't happen because I think there was a mistake in the last update on the description. But I can talk about slime mold, and I love to, especially in the context of the what was sort of covered in the little toy theater thing. So if people came here for the slime mold, I'm here with answers.
I think that would be fantastic, and people are into that. And we did have a question. So there's lots of yeses to slime mold. So, but first there's a question, which is, what are some of your research methodologies?
Well, I'm pretty self-taught. I kind of like to do a lot of hands-on things. Mostly, I feel like that's sort of the best thing for me to grasp what I'm doing in my alchemical experiments and with slime mold and things like that. Researching, I kind of just sort of bounce around a whole lot. I really like to be free from a lot of like disciplines. I like to spread my thoughts around. I feel like that's sort of the more organic way of me understanding things. I know it's not always the most trenchantly accurate understanding of the universe, but I feel like it's my personal understanding of the universe. And I try for things to be mostly, relevant.
Thank you. Yes. The question was elaborated to say, particularly for bridging your practice as a pigment person for craft, and then language as an artist and symbolism. And I think that you did cover that. So would you like to relate slime mold to your presentation a little?
Sure. So I use slime mold in some of my artwork. I don't have any artwork with me. I have some slime mold, but of course, it's black. I'm in a black and white world, as you may have noticed, so you can't quite see it very well. But you see, there's little veins right there. There's the guy. He's bright yellow too. You'll just have to take my word on that. But it's Physarum polycephalum, and I like it. It's an amazing organism. Exhibits all the traits of a sentient being, with at the same time being very, 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 very simple. One thing that I think is particularly fascinating about slime mold is sort of like the way we, as people, utilize an external memory more and more these days. In fact, slime mold also utilizes an external memory in how it leaves its trail and then references whether it needs to go back to where it was, and if that was a necessary thing. So when it leaves its trail, it's leaving sort of like a record of what it's done and where it's been. So what I do is I like to add pigments to it and sort of let it write its own little autobiography in a way, which is sort of like a record of its memory. What's neat about it is its shape is revealing to its behavior. It's like it's showing how it's behaving through the shape of its body. And to me, it's very much like, I don't know, I think it's like it's the living ink that I've always wanted to exist in the world. So.
And can you tell us some of the ways that slime mold has transported ink? Like, what sort of substances have you worked with, and what has the result been?
Well, so I use red iron oxide in mixing it with oatmeal. It likes the red iron oxide. It carries it a lot more than some other colors that I've tried. It wasn't so crazy about Prussian blue, but the red iron oxide does carry a lot better. I found that from what I understand, it requires a certain amount of iron as a micronutrient in its metabolic processes. So I think that sort of helps it in moving the iron around. But even then, it'll still eventually deposit it all out. And then usually have a little tray of oatmeal that I call it a little helivac, and it gets on, and I lift it up out, and then I just have the little trail with the red iron oxide sort of impregnated in the mucus. And the mucus is also a really nice natural binder.
Huh, yeah, so it carries its own binder. It does everything.
It is.
The binder, the pigment, the movement, and the pattern, which ostensibly is one of these patterns that we might perceive with our chthonic organ of perception.
It is, and it's and that's sort of it was sort of a branch I could have gone off on. There are further evolutions of the form constants. So there's bifurcations, and the lattice work can get more elaborate. The Physarum sort of displays what would be known as a Lindenmayer system sort of structure, which is pretty cool because Lindenmayer structures are also thought of as a way of being, in a very formal sense, a kind of grammar. So thinking about it like that, like as a formal grammar, but structure without semantics. That's really what the whole idea behind like the sort of like what the form constants are, sort of like this language that absorbs our meaning. It's neat. Sometimes I think, and I wonder, like if Physarum, like if it perceives in ways that would be like the form constant, like is it really like the chthonic organ, like the way it like moves through its world and has all these like receptors that are like all just like every bit of it's all the same sort of receptor. There's no organs in it. It is like one organ that is everything. So maybe my whole presentation was really about slime mold being the chthonic organ that I want to have inside, I want to awaken within me. And maybe, we can do that through, a more a multi-species relationship. So maybe that's how I want to perceive the world, like a slime mold would.
Mm-hmm. Being the pattern and taking the patterns in. All of them. Yes. Someone says, I can so imagine you having a conversation with Timothy Eli. Actually, I imagine sitting back and listening to you two conversing while I spin paper on my wee spindle.
That sounds like fun.
Thelma Bolliard. Someone says, R for constant similar to sacred geometry.
Our form constants similar to sacred geometry? Yes. Well, I don't know much about sacred geometry. Form constants are, they're just phenomena that were documented. And even like the four that were mentioned by Kluver, they really I don't even think they should be categorized in four. There's so many variations within both. Like they can be under like it could be a spiral and a tunnel and like have these qualities. So they sort of defy categorization in that way too. Sacred geometry, I am not too well schooled at, but in my mind, I would consider this sacred geometry. Yeah.
Yeah.
And as much as you can measure any angles that you're perceiving behind your eyelids.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about the golden ratio and how that is present in so many different geometries.
Like snail shells?
Exactly. That
snail. Or the Nautilus.
I want to point out to everyone that snail was moving across that stage of its own accord. There were no strings. It was an autonomous individual there that continued to roll for quite a while. Thomas, what are you excited about in this moment today? Well, not today because you're here with us at the symposium. You're excited about this presentation, which is just so fantastic. I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate the theater that you built and how it integrated with these complex concepts. But in your world beyond the symposium right now, what's really where are you being led? What's your direction?
Well, I mean, I also operate cyclically, of course. So I'm sort of being led back to where I started. I've been thinking a lot more about pigments as medicine, but and what medicine is. And I go back to, like, with a lot of the pigments I make a lot of pigments using guns I dissolve in acid, which to me is like a large part of like this sort of healing process. But also like the shapes that are made from the pigments, the meaningless shapes. I don't mean to say meaningless. I like the word asemic because it means meaningless, but I like thinking of it as something that absorbs meaning rather than emits meaning. And I feel like it's a medicine that we need more and more when we're just being very much bombarded with information constantly. It would be nice to understand or to experience something where it's like, there's no agenda, I guess. I mean, you could also go outside and look at a leaf. I mean, that would be sort of the same thing. But I like to think about it in like terms of like my practice. And again, like how I, don't want to necessarily have an agenda in my practice. I want my things my work to exist in its own realm and have its own life. And the less I'm a part of that, the more likely that would seem to happen.
Sorry. I was just going to say there's a question here, and I was going to ask you too. You mentioned your the aspect of healing with your work with the guns, and I wondered if you wanted to talk a little about Lead to Life and that part of your process.
Sure. So yeah, I buy handguns. I've started buying handguns now, which is really weird. If you guys knew me at all, you'd think it was very strange. But I've been using them and dissolving them in acid and making Mars Black and Mars Red. I think Dr. Ball mentioned those things earlier, those pigments. And I've been sort of working with this group, Lead to Life, who take firearms and make them into ceremonial shovels in which they plant trees, usually like trees that have of a sacred nature. Though I think most all trees have a sacred nature, but sometimes more specifically sacred natures in places that need healing from gun violence and racial violence. And they do really cool work. They also are very much of the alchemical tradition in the sense that they believe in the transformation. And they make shovels and I make ink. And, I don't know. I think we could make a lot of cool stuff out of those things rather than what most people do with them these days.
Yeah. And then you sometimes the ink that you make out of the guns some of the guns that they've sent to you will go back to them and they'll use in poetry or ceremony as well. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I've yet to use a shovel. I should get a shovel from them. But I would love to, or at least a trowel. I'm not a big gardener, but I would like to have one of their instruments. We've even been talking about possibly working on a printing ink for publications using this gun ink. We'll see. I have to work on my printing ink abilities, but
yeah. We do have time for maybe one quick more question if someone has one, and otherwise we are getting right to the end of our time together. And I believe that Heidi is up next, which I'm very excited about. People who have loved this talk. Someone says, what is it that you do with Yarol? I don't know that word. What's Yarol?
Yarol?
Yes.
I'm not quite sure if I know what Yarol is too.
All right. Well, that will be the mystery that we will end with, since you've invited Oh, yarrow. Okay, they must mean yarrow. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think I can sum this up. Yarrow is really cool. Yarrow is a wonderful herb that is, it's known as soldier's woundwort. And yarrow, of course, has like this historic use. I think it's associated a lot with Achilles and his sort of use on the battlefield of like healing soldiers. Yarrow is an interesting one. I feel like as an herb in like a planetary sense, it sort of straddles Mars and Venus in that it's like it has the healing, compassionate elements of Venus, but it's also well known in like a battle in like war situations. I mean, it's very associated with war. And those two, where those meet, I think is really like, that's a powerful medicine in and of itself. And adding those herbs and things to some of my ink recipes, because I do like to add herbs to my ink recipes. I think yarrow is like probably my favorite go-tos because of that duality and its nature of being a healing herb.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Thomas. And thank you everyone for being here. And we're going to move on over to Heidi for now. And I'm sure that if you have more questions, you can leave them here for Thomas. All right. See you in the next room.
Bye.
Bye.